Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Steve.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, different relationships between paladins and their deities.
In the wilds, the Death Knight.
And in the tavern, what would you do if you had to fight yourself?
Alright, let's go. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited. I know most of the current party has made their way through the podcast.
Yes, yeah, I think you're the last one to actually get your episode on here from the Plot Hooks team, except for Becca. Been trying to work her into the podcast. She's our artist and my wife, but she doesn't play Dungeons & Dragons as much, so I'm trying to get her on an episode to talk about some of the things she does enjoy about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think only in the past few years has it been possible to be much aware of D&D without being a D&D player.
Yes.
Critical Role or just how people interact with it now is a lot different. I've definitely, of the group here, been playing D&D the longest, kind of by default. I've been playing since 1993. Mm-hmm. I'm also older than everyone else, if you couldn't guess. But there's been a big gap. So I don't know if I've played more, but I definitely have a lot of familiarity with the old universes. Yeah. That's part of the reason I'm excited about Death Knight today.
Yes,
that's one of my OG characters from Dragonlance.
Yeah. So. Yeah, excited to talk about Paladins and Death Knights and lots of different things related to a character that you had in one of our campaigns recently set in Carrick. Before we get into that, just a couple announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube if you'd like to get the podcast that way. Remember, of course, our standing giveaway for whenever we hit 250 followers on Twitter, giving away a D&D 5th edition sourcebook to a lucky follower. And of course, it'd be awesome of you if you could support us on Patreon. This coming week is whenever we release the first batch of world building info for our homebrew world of Carrick. Hopefully this will spark a few ideas for you dungeon masters out there. Next week's episode, we will actually be covering a lot of that information in our podcast. But you'll get access to all that information if you're a patron over there on Patreon. And regardless, we just appreciate your support. It makes the podcast even better for you, helps us improve each and every week. With that out of the way, Paladins and their deities. Zach and I actually mentioned your character as we discussed using the absurd to inspire, turning different traits of D&D on their heads and using them to inspire your character. Your character, Ivan, was interesting because you took a paladin character and instead of creating the typical knight that's just devoted to their particular deity, you turn it in a different direction where the relationship with his particular patron, Lathander, was a little bit different. And I think this is a great way to add variety to rolling your paladin or cleric characters. Classic classes where your magical abilities are sourced from a divine entity. And there's many different ways to craft the relationship between a character and their deity that aren't just the typical I follow this deity and they give me powers sort of relationship. So tell us a little bit about Ivan.
Yeah, Ivan was an idea I had a very long time ago. There were a couple of things that went into it. Sometimes you just make simple mechanical decisions. One thing, I'm a big fan of Critical Role, and there wasn't a paladin in the main cast of Critical Role either in Season 1 or Season 2 until a thing happens. And so I wanted to just explore something I hadn't seen over and over again mechanically. That was a starting point. But there were kind of two things going on. One is like a random thought I had one day that wasn't even related to D&D, but it was kind of about the idea of performing. So I was thinking of John Cena, the wrestler, who, is kind of branded himself as this character that appears to be in many ways kind of a figure that is a, U.S. Marine, maybe, kind of a, always the good guy, always on the side of right. Maybe he has a little bit of an attitude sometimes, but it's not much of one compared to, other
wrestlers
of the past. Yeah, he's the, got that square jaw and everything. He looks the part. But John Cena is not a Marine. John Cena was never in the armed forces. He's not that person. But I somehow wondered, like, what if he was supposed to go save the world, right? What if the person who kind of pretended to be the hero had to be the hero? And that made a lot of sense within D&D, because you have gladiators who presumably kind of assume personae. They're not actually necessarily amazing at fighting, but they might do show fighting, things of that nature. So Ivan Brighthearth, whose real name is Ivan Hooper, kind of threw that in there to make him, it's even more ridiculous, right? Yeah. He's got a kind of big fancy last name that matches a god that he allegedly represents, kind of a good guy god, Lathander, pretty undoubtedly positive. And I think what excited me about that was I got to play a character who was kind of older, not setting out on their life's journey or trying to make a name for themselves, already famous but only sort of, not really as himself, has traveled around, has a little bit of jadedness to him, but now has been drafted to kind of pay back the debt of Lathander letting him kind of represent him for fake all these years. Yeah. And so in the events that transpire in the world, it made sense to give him something other than than the standard vanilla oath. So I went with the Vengeance Oath, because I thought that was a little more, it's more of a divine instrument kind of thing. Like, you don't get to make decisions, right? Like the Vengeance Oath includes the tenet that, like, you have to focus on the greater evil all the time. That's not a decision you get to make. Yeah. Right. And so that can be very, thank you for not making it worse in certain situations. Yeah. There was usually an obvious path, but if the campaign had been more like intricate, involved, one of those 100-session campaigns, I could definitely see being put to some decisions where it's like, I can't help you right now because I got to go fight that thing. Yeah. And then, But yeah, so I guess in general, his inspiration was, what if someone's life got changed completely because they actually had to do what they were pretending to do all these years? And that's, I don't think it's that common of an inspiration, but it's also not it's not an overwhelming backstory. I can describe it in 2 sentences and then just kind of build off that.
Yeah, that's great. Some of the best backstory ideas come from little blurbs of information that are then just expounded upon, and they affect every single aspect of our lives and of our characters' actions, and it can really create some great narratives.
Well, and it also let me build the character fairly confidently. I think that was nice. Like, well, am I proficient in religion? Well, no, I didn't actually know anything about religion, and I'm about 48 years old. And, I didn't suddenly one day wake up with knowledge of Holy Scripture. I woke up with, a voice in my head telling me what to do. Yeah. So you also get to grow into being the hero, so to speak. Because paladins often, even when they're interesting, the stereotype is they're a guy or gal with big armor, auras, god, they're good at going into combat first, like all these things like that. And that was true of him, but that wasn't necessarily the personality he was born with. So it was sometimes a little hesitancy or a little, resignation. Well, I guess this is what we got to do now, that kind of gallows humor. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about the relationship that he has with the deity, we outline 6 different, and there's a lot more of them out there, and there's a lot more nuance within each one. Yeah. But there's kind of 6 different main relationships that a paladin or cleric can have with their deity. We mentioned the follower relationship, which we won't really get into, just the classic, I follow this deity was important to me, I grew up following this deity, or however you initially got into the particular religion, but you worked your way up the priestly or the knight ranks, so to speak, and this deity gave me powers because I followed them. Yeah.
It feels like that's the rational paladin, right? The truest believer in a sense. And I don't think it's necessarily uninteresting, because you can problematize that in many ways. They can be suffering a crisis of faith because of the events of the campaign, for instance. So it's not necessarily bad. It also doesn't necessarily extend beyond what you would normally expect. Yeah. So.
Your particular situation falls into what we termed an elected relationship. A relationship where, for some reason, you were chosen by the deity itself. You didn't have any interest in following them before, and you were chosen to complete a task for them. And you, of course, having impersonated a paladin of Lathander for many years in the gladiatorial ranks, were just drafted as Lathander had this need in the campaign at this particular time to, okay, you've been pretending to be my paladin, it's time for you to actually pull your weight, and just chose you, and it created a really interesting dynamic between you and your deity.
Right. Well, and I mean, you know, that there are many archetypes of this as well. I mean, certainly, you know, the entire Old Testament is about people who are that, you know, in many ways. You know, they are chosen by God rather than the other way around in many cases. And I think, you know, there's plenty of fodder for that. But I think, I think it's interesting because certainly in D&D, gods have, like, very manifest and specific power that they can grant to people. And this isn't like a warlock where it's the person's failing that makes them do that. It's almost just like circumstances beyond their control. So it's an interesting way to build that out because you get to explore each other. Yeah. So I thought that was the most interesting part of role-playing Ivan, was sort of the figuring out what I'm supposed to be, given that it's definitely true and definitely real. Right? There's no, like, D&D also doesn't really deal with doubt in deities very much, because I mean, you can go visit them if you want to. I mean, they're pretty real. You know, you could make a campaign around them being harder or more ineffable or something like that, but it's pretty hard to doubt that.
It's hard to doubt
this
that
thing that lets me heal wounds is real. You know?
Exactly. So you have the follower relationship, you have the elected relationship, you also have the convenience relationship, a situation where perhaps both the deity and the PC have goals that they both wish to accomplish, and aligning together allows both of them to reach their different goals. And this can have both a positive take on it, where it's a positive alignment, or a negative alignment where the particular player character doesn't like this arrangement, but it is just going along with it because it is convenient. I think specifically, as you mentioned, you know, the paladin multi-classing that happened in Critical Role, kind of the instance, without going into too many spoilers, of Vax and the Raven Queen in Campaign 1, where because of his particular desires that caused him to commit himself to the Raven Queen, you know, they went along and began a relationship together in order to accomplish their specific goals, but they didn't necessarily have, you know, the most positive relationship at times.
They didn't, and you know, this is a good example. So it's easy to think of a paladin of the god of light, or a paladin of the god of war, or a paladin of the god of whatever. But what about a paladin of the god of commerce, right? A lot of worlds have a god of commerce. Being a paladin of the god of commerce does not make a ton of sense, like in a certain sense. Like, what are you going to go? But what if they need a paladin and make a bargain with someone? Or what if you want to play, for whatever reason, a good paladin of the god of poison? You know, you can come up with lots of ways in which that kind of works. Some of those are similar to that warlock-patron relationship. I hate you and wish you weren't here, but you're where my power comes from, so I have to do what you say a little bit. You know, but you could also have kind of a mutual, you know, you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of thing. So, you know, those things are a little bit interesting. And it's a way to get to paladin of odd mythos in some cases. Very true. Because, again, I don't think many people sat down, you know, I want to be a paladin of the god of, you know, books or something, you know.
The god of civilization. My job is to stand on a city wall as a paladin.
But yeah, you could totally imagine it in certain contexts.
Along sort of that same line, you have an alignment relationship where instead of you and a deity coming together to accomplish your own goals, you and the deity share the same goals. And so as life went on, your paths just sort of aligned, and an alliance was made to pursue the shared goal together. You know, where there's actually alignment there of ideals and view of the world and hope for the future with the particular goal.
Yeah, I think, I can absolutely imagine that. I think, if you're looking for pop culture inspiration there, you have something like Obi-Wan Kenobi. You have somebody who was once rebellious and has now come to kind of accept the ambiguity more, and, now they want to, pass on whatever they've learned, or, kind of pay back the powers that be, or, things of that nature. So yeah, that absolutely makes sense too. But yeah, nobody has to start. Yeah, it'd be interesting to play a paladin in that regard, because at what stage in that relationship do you play it? Because I think, honestly, that's kind of what happened with Ivan. By the end, Ivan was very committed as a paladin, but initially was kind of following the decree, and eventually became more, proactive. So.
Yeah, and a lot of that, I think, with him had to do with discovering just more and more things that he didn't know.
Correct.
Things that the gods were aware were going on behind the scenes that he was unaware of, and the more and more he kind of saw what was actually going on, it was like the worldview of Lathander made more and more sense to him, and he kind of began to adopt that particular view of the world, and their outlooks began to align.
Right, the old the Neo in the Matrix kind of journey. Yeah, that's true.
On the more negative side of the ways you can have your relationship is you and a deity can have a mistrusting relationship. Perhaps you're even still aligned on your goals, aligned on what you want, but as time is going on, there's something about the patron that is causing you mistrust, and while you continue to serve their interests and they seem to align with your interests, maybe you're struggling and having a little bit of a crisis of faith because you're not sure that what you're doing is right, or you're not sure their motivations. And again, this reminds me a little bit of Vax and the Raven Queen, where there was so much mistrust because, I'm a paladin, but I'm a paladin of the god of death. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And is she really something that can be trusted in this particular space? And it can create some interesting storytelling opportunities as you're dealing with mistrust of your particular deity. And that is a lot easier to do, I feel like, in Dungeons & Dragons, because the gods are built to a certain extent like the Olympic pantheon, in that they're intentionally not perfect. They have very limited domains, and they're not infallible in any way, shape, or form. And you can have those sort of mistrusting and even borderlining on antagonistic relationships with a deity, and not just, as you mentioned, a warlock patron.
Yeah. Well, and there's different ways for deities to react to that as well. I mean, I think paladins in ideal situations should have crisis of faith. I mean, the whole class is built out that you have this oath that you have to follow, and you're always going to fall short of it to some degree. It's impossible not to, right? And in D&D, often that's because you don't want to make the party hate you. From a almost like a player standpoint, you don't want to be like, no, I can't do that because there's this other thing I have to do over here, and I'm a paladin. So having that mistrust because you have a greater affinity for your party than for the god to some degree. Perhaps you're a paladin of like a newer deity, and maybe you start to see a side of them you weren't aware was there. I can imagine that sort of thing happening, especially when they are a mysterious deity. There are many out there. Or they go through their own kind of changes, right? I was a paladin of Lathander. If you followed Forgotten Realms over a very long period of time, there was this whole thing with Lathander that was very, very complicated and confusing. And I won't spoil that book trilogy, but, it was weird, and I can imagine, dealing with that as a follower being an interesting way to do it.
Yeah.
And I mean, paladins should have occasional moments of mistrust. As a permanent relationship, it's interesting, but they should have difficulty with that. I mean, this is, episode 8 Luke Skywalker, right? I mean, that's what this is at this time. Again, Jedi are very archetypal paladins. If you haven't heard that, before, I think they're the best example of what a paladin looks like in pop culture. Because I think sometimes the paladin-like characters in stories get used as the cops or get used as the kind of monolithic like knights that are the boring part of the story. You know what I mean? And I think Jedi are a good example of definitely warriors, blade wielders who have, you know, kind of power, but it's relatively limited in scope in some ways, and kind of this ethos to follow. And when they don't, it can cause them harm. You know, and I think that's, you know, that to me is in many ways more interesting than a bunch of dudes in shiny armor with swords, who do god things all the time, right? So I think that there's so much to play in a paladin that's not that, and I think sometimes looking at the various Jedi, looking at various samurai, looking at various things like that from different pop culture can be helpful in that regard. Because, I mean, they have that, you know, lawful, stupid, you know, kind of reputation. Partially that's the second edition version's fault. Imagine that there were only Oath of Devotion paladins. Yeah. That was the second edition paladin and became the, you know, kind of long-term stereotype of what paladins are like. So
the final relationship that we wanted to look at was the Oathbreaker relationship. The relationship where you have this communion with this particular deity, and you got to a point and you broke your oath. The Oathbreaker subclass is actually in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 97, and it's meant for breaking from the good and turning to some sort of evil ambition or dark power. The requirements for it in the Dungeon Master's Guide are for the paladin to be evil, and the specific sacred oath features that you've chosen for whatever class was already there are replaced with the Oathbreaker subclass features. But this is a legitimate relationship that I think a PC can have in certain contexts with their deity. Perhaps it doesn't go all the way to becoming evil, but actually reneging on the oath and the commitment that you made to your particular deity and gaining power from another source for a time in order to accomplish a goal which was completely askew from the one that your deity wanted and from the path that your patron set you on.
Yeah, I could see that being very interesting. There's a popular multi-class option, which is, of course, the Pally lock, and that's the Paladin Warlock, and that's for almost entirely mechanical reasons. Like, it turns out there's a lot of dovetailing between, you know, being a Paladin and being a Warlock. It's very useful to have both of those sets of abilities. But that is a tough row to hoe. Yeah. I follow a god, also I have this pact, right? What if that was an Oathbreaker, right? What if they broke their oath because their god couldn't help them save their wife's life, and they had to, you know, make this pact instead. And
again,
then you get
back to Jedi right, and Anakin Skywalker.
Precisely what I was making reference to. I mean, but there are many reasons to imagine a paladin breaking their oath for reasons that could conceivably be justified. Do they bear those Oathbreaker traits as kind of like a punishment, right? Oh, now everybody's going to be afraid of you. So you have this aura, right? Everybody used to love you, now they're all afraid of you, but you can channel that like angrily to, you know, help do good things. So it's interesting. I could imagine a neutral or, you know, fallen paladin that's not necessarily just the worst.
Yes,
you
exactly.
know, from a motivational standpoint. It could be interesting.
And
the DMG version doesn't really suggest that possibility, but I think it'd be easy to customize that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the option that it gives for if you have a player being an Oathbreaker paladin, it gives an option for them to atone. You know, whereas you know, perhaps that's not exactly what you and your particular collaborative story. That might not be the story that you want to tell. But
well, and it's kind of like, you know, those domain spells too kind of tell a funny story. Like, you can use mechanics in an interesting way. Like, what the heck is a PC going to do with Bestow Curse? Right? That isn't a good spell for a PC to have, because usually just kill the bad guys. You don't make them sad for a month. Yeah. That's not really how that works. But at the same time, there could be interesting role-playing opportunities for that kind of domain spell that could be fun to play around with. Yeah. So, yeah.
But yeah, there's lots of other different kinds of relationships that you can have out there between a paladin and their deity, and there's, of course, nuances to each of these ones that we've mentioned. But if you're looking at rolling a paladin character anytime in the near future, thinking about the particular relationship that you're going to have with the person who's giving you your powers is a great place to start, not only in terms of defining the character, but also defining how you roleplay as well.
Yeah, I think it's so key. I think there are certain classes where you can have a personality and also a skill set. I mean, but you could also be an easygoing paladin. But the question then is why? How does that affect your relationship with your deity, right? A lot of it is very framed and kind of baked in.
Sure.
You can't really be you don't have to make that decision if you're a kind of mild-mannered druid or something like that. You just be one.
Yep,
it's not a big deal. So,
well, I think that just about wraps up the prime material today. So, what do you say we head off to the wilderness?
I'm happy to. Yeah, let's go.
All right. Here in the wilds, going to be talking a little bit about Death Knights today, staying on the Paladin train. The Death Knight is, of course, a Paladin that at some point during their life committed a horrible fault and led to a dramatic fall from grace from their particular deity, and then never made any effort to make anything right, and just eventually died without ever trying to atone. And instead of passing on to the afterlife after that occurred, this particular fallen paladin can instead be turned into a powerful undead knight, which resembles a skeleton in full plate mail, which very powerful CR-17 monster with some pretty great abilities and some really interesting opportunities for storytelling.
Yeah, definitely. They resemble in many ways a 17th level paladin. They have domain spells, ranging from, and some of these are the definite paladin block. They've got their command and the hold person and the elemental weapon. They also get banishment and the insanely good destructive wave. They've got some definite power pack. They're often cast as leaders of undead armies, and I think they work very well in that regard because like any good paladin, they have an aura, and that aura is to give everybody within 60 feet of them, they and them get advantage on turn undead rolls.
Yes, yeah.
So
big
PC is
game
not
against basically any
PC's
party.
not knowing that, right? If they're if they've had those experiences where their clerics went boom and turned a ton of undead, suddenly a Death Knight is there and they turn 20 undead and 2 of them fail.
Yeah,
and you have a very different fight
exactly
than you used to have.
Yeah.
So I could see that being awesome.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And they do often command large armies for that reason. That's very much their shtick, is they're almost like lieutenants in a regard, and they can be good bosses because they have minions, just like the vampires we discussed last episode with their vampire spawn. They have their own built-in minions that they can be in control over. They are interesting to me in the fact that there's a little blurb, not long, but a little blurb on their history in the Monster Manual on page 47 that talks about them atoning, that talks about them being redeemed. And they, of course, can be completely wicked and never interested in repentance. And I think almost all of them would fall into that category because they chose not to do so in life. Why would they do so in death?
I believe that, in fact, it's interesting because obviously the picture here and the blurb they have is of Lord Thoth, which is a character that now lives in Ravenloft but was originally from Dragonlance. And in Dragonlance novels, in which he's a pretty prominent, kind of side villain, I guess, it is evident that he wishes he could do something about it, i.e. atone, and just can't. So he's now kind of bound to whatever fate he has, but is able to be swayed by certain elements of his personality to not always be a total adversary, I guess is the way to put it. He falls in love with someone and kind of cuts them a break, but in a way that, you know, is presumed to, I think, hurt him or cause him physical torture because of not being as bad as he should be. And
that's interesting to me that there's that option there where if a party is especially interested in social encounters and not throwing themselves headlong into battle at every single encounter, perhaps the party can discover some things if he is a boss of a longer arc where perhaps they can actually convince the Death Knight to atone for their sins. Maybe the Death Knight is a lieutenant over a bigger army, but still the servant of an even greater entity, and perhaps you can actually enlist this particular entity's help. The Monster Manual says that the only way they can be released from this eternal torment is by that atoning action.
Which means that first time you beat them, they're going to be back. You know, in one way or another, they're not gone. So it definitely builds its own quest in a way. But if you're going to introduce a character like this, and it's not just part of a big old huge, you know, level 20 giant endgame type battle, which is what it is. But if you're going to have something like that, you probably want to create an entire backstory for that character. Because there's always a potential to figure out what that redemption quest would look like. It'd be interesting to me to imagine like a Death Knight who does not want to be redeemed, but can be, trying to stop the PCs from doing so. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but that's intriguing,
an interesting concept
in its own way.
They're interesting not because of their monstrous characteristics, but because of that backstory. They're interesting because they're fallen paladins. You know, there's so many creatures that are interesting just because they're interesting monsters or they have interesting traits. You know, the rock is a giant bird. You know, there's these demons and devils which have these interesting characteristics that just want to destroy and corrupt and take over. But here's this entity which has this desire for a backstory built into his character because what is interesting about them is the fact that they used to be good and fell. Which is even different from a lich, you know, which is a similar, you know, a lich is a kind of a wizard Death Knight, like you might argue. But they usually were jerks, right? They wanted to become immortal through whatever means necessary. The lich story is usually not, you know, let's fix him. It's usually this story. Has to sacrifice hundreds of people to keep himself going, you know, type of. So
the Death Knight is a much more interesting, you know, kind of tragic figure. And I mean, and like you said, it's not exactly like the world's most interesting text box for a monster. It's, you know, has a really big double flame strike it can do once per day. That's the Hellfire Orb. Not the power word kill it used to have in 2nd edition. Don't get me started. That was a big part of Lord Soth's character back at the Dragonlance era. It no longer is, fortunately. Nobody wants that. But that they also have the, you know, not only do they have advantage on being turned, but they're also proficient, so they have +9. I mean, they're not going anywhere. You know, like your channel divinity turned undead is not going to work. Like pretty much ever. So So they've got all the stat block stuff of just tough, big damage, hard to deal with. But I think there's so much more to it because they don't die. You can't really get rid of them unless you know, solve a story. You know, or they're always a permanent threat at the very least. So that's interesting too.
Great characters, great monsters to introduce into a campaign. All right, well, I think that's enough clanging around with the Death Knight. Let's head back to the tavern and get some refreshment.
Sounds good.
And we're in here in the friendly confines of the tavern. What's the plot hook that we're going to be looking at today?
Yeah, the question is, what would you do if you had to fight yourself?
This is actually referencing something that actually occurred with Ivan in the campaign that he was in. Because one of the options is it could be a vision where an entity is asking you to prove something. And that was the case for you whenever you were communing at a temple to Lathander in Corden Harbor.
That's right. Yeah, I had to... I kind of entered into a vision quest or something of that nature where I had to, kind of defeat my old self in gladiatorial combat, real gladiatorial combat. And I made some really bad rolls and almost lost, even though the other version of me was kind of fighter Ivan and didn't have all the cool abilities. So that was funny. But it was straightforward and right there in the thing. But it was a great role-playing opportunity to kind of have to make a decision that this isn't real or that this is a test or, whatever the case may be. But I can absolutely see a situation where, if framed in the right way, you could feel like you were having an out-of-body experience and trying to kill your actual self or something like that, and therefore much more resistant.
Yeah, there's many different ways that you can take it.
Or where when you hit it, it hurts you. Mm-hmm. What does that... I mean... any number of possibilities.
Yeah, there's so many different ways that you could take that. With Lathander, what he was trying to get at in that particular situation was it didn't really matter to him whether or not you won or you lost, which he told you after the fact. He wanted to see that you didn't give up and go back to your former life or go back into the gladiatorial stance. He wanted you to see that you were actually going to continue forward in the quest that you were actually on. And so you can have it where you have got this vision where you're the thing that you're trying to prove can be a number of different things. Right. It could be, okay, this entity actually wants you to win. It could be an Obi-Wan Kenobi dueling Darth Vader thing where his desire wasn't even to win. His desire was to sacrifice himself, where you could have your deity asking you to do any number of different things in this particular vision.
Sure.
You could also find yourself fighting against yourself in perhaps a campaign with doppelgangers or some other impersonator of you.
Yeah, I could see that being a spell, that someone has. It might even be one. I don't know. Certainly they've had the makes a simulacrum of you to fight you kind of thing is a thing that, bad wizards love to do to people. So definitely makes sense there. But yeah, you can imagine an emotional thing. And you get to metagame more than usual because you get to counter your own best abilities theoretically, which is kind of interesting. Like if you know that it really is a version of yourself that's going to try to do the most powerful thing, you can go, well, okay, what would that be? All right, I'm going to try to metagame against that because I know. You don't have to be super smart. You're not cheating. You're not kind of out of the spirit of the game. If you're like, well, all right. That's the, in a sense, not even really metagaming because you're literally taking your own character's knowledge and using it against what this foe is trying to do. So it could give you an excuse to do that kind of hyper-strategic stuff that every DM hates when the player's read the Monsters Manual 3 times and knows exactly what the bad guy's going to do. Yes, exactly. That could also happen where you are fighting yourself as part of something inside of your own head, like not a vision per se, not an out-of-body experience, but where you're actually fighting through entrapments in your own mind. I'm reminded of the first Arkham Asylum game where Batman kept getting trapped in his interactions with Scarecrow in Scarecrow's world, where he had to kind of go through those little situations where he's essentially, it's illustrating a fight that's going on in his own mind, and it can create some interesting role play opportunities there. And that's what all of these things do, is fighting yourself can give some really interesting opportunities to tell stories because it allows you to confront different things you don't like. It allows you to take out aggression perhaps on different things which you hate about yourself or hate about your particular path. It allows you to discover different things about yourself. And if you can find a way as a DM to work this into a story through any of these different ways,
it can allow you to tell a really interesting narrative.
It absolutely can. I think one of the most famous instances of this is the Paladin transformation moment in Final Fantasy IV or Final Fantasy II, which was a really important moment in gaming history because you're talking about a Japanese RPG in which the main character is a dark knight and goes to a cave where he turns into a paladin version of himself, but then the previous version of himself attacks him. And you have this duel. This was 1991, and it was something that hadn't really been seen in an RPG before. You know what I mean? And it was you know, a computer RPG had never had a moment that dramatic that happened on a battle screen.
Yeah.
And it was really cool for that reason. And I think, you know, that's become so iconic that, like, it's easy to imagine, you know, having to fight an Oathbreaker version of yourself because of something that the god did or something that, you know, to set things right or, you know, something of that nature. That is, you know, makes for a really dramatic moment and could be really cool.
Yeah.
So, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, well, I think that just about wraps up this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks for joining me today, Steve.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to all the listeners out there for listening. From me, Samuel, Steve, Zach, Mike, Dave, Matt, Becca, and of course, Podcast Pupperelli. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.